have Joe Madden here, former CEO of Xpansiv, as well as many other accomplishments that he can introduce on his side. And I think what we want to talk about is a very frank discussion about carbon markets, about scaling it, what are the changes needed, how do we go about making this into a real institutional market from here. So, but I'll let you introduce yourself, Joe.
Great. Well, thanks. Super excited to be here and see the energy that everyone has around this. So feel honored to be here, and thanks for having me. I'll give a quick background on myself. I originally was in supply chain digitization, so mid-90s to early 2000s. I'm not a technologist at all, but I was around sort of the design and implementation of the digitization of an industry. Then I ended up doing a graduate program at Presidio Graduate School that resulted in a thesis that was on the supply side of the California cap and trade system, which was supposed to be a scalable approach to offsets. And then we sort of learned some of the limitations. And then we actually wrote a paper in 2015 timeframe that talked about, we published and presented in Paris, but it talked about things like the proliferation of data, DLT systems, things like that. And then we proved out some things technologically, but we realized that there was no market infrastructure whatsoever. So then we turned around and spent a lot of time building market infrastructure, which became Xpansiv. And all the time we were building out a bunch of sort of, I would say, advanced data capabilities and things like that. And we're now we've spun out what we call Fiùtur, which is really an information exchange that's not fully public yet, or not in the public listing sense, just still sort of in stealth. But I think it is designed to facilitate a lot of the things that we're talking about here today. So super excited.
Yeah, thank you, Joe, for making the time. You know, we talk a lot about carbon markets as a nascent market, and the question is, how do we go to the next stage? It's still a very heterogeneous, illiquid, and as one of the earlier panels was talking about, full of, you could call it some shady credits that nobody wants. Right? There's a massive quality spread, there's a massive asymmetry of information. How do we get to a stage where we can bring on real high quality supply in volume? And would love to hear your thoughts on that.
So, so first, stepping back, I think wholesale what you have is you have kind of an underlying change in the global economic system where you're migrating away from what was the old world underlying, which I would say things like crude or fossils, and you're moving to a new underlying asset, which is fundamentally carbon. So that's expression of carbon across all financial assets, all the way from capital formation to any of these registered assets, and then ultimately into risk reporting and things like that. So that's foundational. So when we talk about this at a meta level, I think about this in terms of large scale energy transition assets versus this is a carbon market. Everything is a carbon market at this point. That's kind of like carbon is energy, it is food, it is all of these things. So I think we have to think about it in that scale to really start to make the kind of progress that we need to make. If we bifurcate down into this is the voluntary market, there's nothing voluntary about what's been going on the planet. Like, it's existential. So even the term voluntary makes it, oh, that's nice to do. It's a picture of orangutan on a sustainability report, but it's really designed for marketing. No, this is like fundamentally a financial issue that's going to permeate everything. So I think like thinking about that in that terms is kind of a starting point to even what are we actually dealing with. So
yeah, exactly. You know, if we want to bring hundreds of millions of tons or later billions of tons of carbon into the market, that's high quality, trustworthy, because that's going to be the demand side. The demand is already bubbling up. I do agree that voluntary is just kind of a term that doesn't quite really get to the necessity of these things. And what's voluntary today will become compulsory at a later date. And I think a lot of corporates are realizing that. How do we get that supply when, a lot of the traditional verification systems are struggling with backlogs and delays while forests get cut, while deforestation is only picking up? So, one of the things that we have discussed in the past is how do we build a consensus mechanism amongst all the different participants that really brings technology, brings reputation, brings clarity to this market, where you build standards that can bring that amount of supply we need to the market and give that comfort to the buyer that I'm buying something real, I'm buying something that actually has an impact and is not just a marketing brochure.
So when I think about this, I know some of the questions about commodities and things like that, but if you think about carbon, it is the first fully digital construct of a deliverable instrument on the planet. So if you think about in the old days, you had, let's say it's 1910 or 1915, you had what are now major behemoth energy companies, say Standard Oil or BP. They started building out basically exploration and then extraction and then delivery and all of the things that go into what would be that system. This is actually a digital supply chain at the most fundamental level. So carbon is never physically delivered, although from a regulatory perspective, there is no concept in our global markets of not having something physically delivered. So mapping from sort of what is or was physical to 150 years of regulatory construct to something that is fundamentally digital is not a small thing. But understanding it at that level, this is what we're actually doing. It is a digital supply chain in that regards. And we have to think about it like that. But we also have to recognize that there's massive systems, world trade organizations, all kinds of international law about how things move around the world, and they're all designed on physical for the most part. So I think that's a critical distinction when we think about how this works, is that we are really mapping the physical world into a digital construct and then delivering that.
Yeah, and one of the things that, when you're trying to bring scale, but it's something new, there needs to be some degree of backwards compatibility with the existing systems. How do we get the banks, how do we get the large institutions to be comfortable with this new asset class? And that will require consensus across a large number of entities. And I know you've been doing some work along those lines with Fiùtur, but your thoughts on that would be greatly appreciated.
Yeah. So when I think about this, just had the benefit, or I don't know if it was benefit, like from a sort of life perspective, but sort of struggling through some of the scaling issues. What a lot of I think the challenge is mapping into this looks like that. It may be very different from an underlying construct with regards to this is a digital pipeline, but for people that look at ratings, for people that understand risk, it has to look like other things and map into their systems. So understanding those systems and making that explicit to each one of those groups in the way that they see the world. Insurers see the world through a certain lens. Banks see the world through a certain lens. Hedge funds, all of these regulators see the world through a certain lens, and they all have a lens that's already built. So mapping some of these things into their existing frameworks, even though they may be very different, makes it really easy for them to consume that. So when we talk about consensus, I think the more we can actually map into this looks just like that, you can make quantum leaps really quickly. They're like, oh, it's just like that. Now let's move forward. If it looks like it's coming in and it's foreign, they go into a hunker down mode and they can't. It's like a animal that doesn't have that on their prey screen. They just don't see it.
Yeah, we have the same thing with insurance and banking when we do that. It has to look like the analog that they are used to, makes life a lot easier. One of the other interesting things about carbon to me is that it is a digital supply chain that also touches on a lot of the parts of the world where property rights and the rule of law might not be as strong. When you're dealing with physical commodities in these places, at least at some point, you get to have custody of a physical asset. In the case of carbon, you're in a wide array of jurisdictions, a wide array of areas of the world where that might be very difficult. How do we work on those challenges, especially given the different types of carbon there are?
So again, going back to that, the construct of a digital supply chain, if you look at other globally traded materials and things like that, they generally will have a whole set of terms. Like there's E&P companies, there's refiners, there's whatever. And there's a set of roles in a digital supply chain that you can actually start to define, and they start to look like the rest of the world from a sort of compartmentalization perspective. The other thing that can be applied is there's tons of information or maps that already exist around how do you have global commerce across areas that maybe don't have a strong rule of law and things like that. There are all kinds of things that can be mapped in. So drawing on that stuff and evolving it versus trying to create an entirely new mechanism, I think there's a lot to be learned in the way that, let's say, some of the other things transact on the planet, right? So there's all kinds of global commerce across political systems and so forth in, say, agriculture. Almost all of that is defined. Those systems work. Things get on ships. They get delivered across, very different economic and political systems. That all exists today. And then there is going back and finding some of that, evolving it up to this sort of digital construct, and then building off that, as opposed to this is a completely new asset. That's a hard thing to digest, full stop. So thinking about it in those terms, I think we can, a lot of the things that you guys have done already in insurance, you've basically taken that and evolved that entire market.
Yeah, and taking that to like the work you're doing with the different stakeholders in the market, what have you found has been promising, and what remains to be a big challenge, in terms of evolving this market to where you think it needs to get to?
So I think the idea of roles is critical, right? So in these other markets that already exist where trillions of dollars transact, there are very clear roles. If you go talk to a bank, they know where they live. If you talk to a fund, you know where they live. If you talk to an insurer, they know where they live. In our systems, I think a lot of this, because it's all digital, you can jump over. I'll use an example. In a digital world, you can step over a line that is invisible. An example would be you can stand in California and have one foot in Nevada, and you have two different sets of laws, but the line is actually invisible. But as soon as you step over that line, it's problematic. I think one of the challenges here is starting to define the digital roles that exist and handoffs that actually happen within that map to the physical world. So I think that is a major mapping exercise that needs to happen. Because once you have a digital platform, you're like, I can do that, and I can do that, and I can do that. And you're like, but you just broke 5 laws. Like, you could do that, but that's not the way the rest of the world can consume that. And we could either argue about that for the next 25 years, or we could just map to something that they all check the box. So I think that is a critical understanding of what needs to happen with regards to those roles in a digital construct.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the crypto market has been finding that out slowly but surely. You said earlier that the voluntary concept doesn't really work here. It is not voluntary. It's a necessity. How do we get the system to start to buy into that? Like, we obviously have some very great voluntary programs that are making an impact. How do we get to a stage where it's almost a compulsory thing for companies to buy this?
So I think about this in terms of, so a couple of things. One is when we talk about the, quote, voluntary market, we're generally talking about offsets, right? Offsets come with additionality and subjective other things that are part of the construct. But if we start thinking about carbon as a fundamental asset, you start to think about it different. There may be offsets as one expression. There may be insets, that's another expression. It's a different use. There may be, you're just paying for preservation of that asset, right? So there are all kinds of other, if you look across the financial or capital markets, there's all kinds of asset classes that are closely related but different. So I think about this, if we start to fundamentally think of carbon as an asset class in and of itself, you're going to start to be able to express that in different ways. So I think when we talk about voluntary carbon, you're generally moving into offsets. But if you look at the corporate exposure, a lot of it has to do with their own supply chain, which relates to insets. Them from a digital construct and the way you would actually prove that outcome, they're not that different. But you have to start thinking about this in that way, as opposed to this market and then this market and then this market. And I think starting with carbon as a foundational asset class, that all of a sudden makes a forest value intrinsic the minute you understand it as such. You're not trying to say, get rid of your sins. You're saying this already has value. So how do we express that value? How do we expose that value? That's fundamentally different than I think things have been thought of, largely because that concept of voluntary or nice to have. An asset is an asset. Like, people want assets. So when we start just bringing that down to a core level, like, that is the new asset class on the planet. Like, the ledger has flipped. So then how are we going to express that? And these instruments are all just expressions of that value.
Yeah, in a sense, carbon to me it's akin to the concept of implied vol and options, where it's a single measure to actually capture a giant set of externalities that we are trying to value, right? Whether it's loss of biodiversity, whether it's a loss of many other things. It's not a one-dimensional thing just about carbon, but carbon acts as a ledger, basically, to measure your impact around the world. I guess we have about a couple minutes left, I'm told. So, where do you see, us in a few years? Like, where would you like this market to be? What sort of, structure do you think we are headed towards?
So I think we're going to ideally get to a series of relatively well-defined roles. And if I was going to go back to that oil analogy, where you have a new set of E&P players that are fundamentally charging ahead with front-end technology and capable of effectively defining and extracting and creating assets. And they will map into a system that can consume those assets in the same way that other materials have mapped into the markets. So I think that's like the next evolution that needs to happen. And then all of a sudden you'll unlock not only the capital side, but you'll also allow for what I would think of as almost like the boom in tech when there was no tech. They were able to define all kinds of things. If you get the roles right here, you can let tech go just gangbusters if you get the right roles and the right structure. And I think then you'll see just an explosion and markets consuming this in a very sort of systematic way, the same way that they consume other things. You'll see capital flow. You'll see all of the products that emerge, just like you see in well-developed or mature capital markets. I think that would be the win, and then you can let people go in, specialize, and get very good at different aspects or different roles within that, and they'll all do very well. It'll be a win-win-win-win-win-win across the spectrum.
Yeah, I think, I guess the last question I would ask is, one of the things that's also unique about carbon is that there probably needs to be a global coordination amongst different countries to make this market happen, right? People have to recognize the effect that carbon emissions have on the planet. That's not always as clear, as you would hope. How do we tackle that?
So I think I'm going to stay with the offset analogy. I think you are going to see more and more compliance markets. But if you look at what California did in the sort of 2010 timeframe, they have a subset of some of the physical market that can come into that market for cost control. I think what you're going to see here is all you need is one or two compliance markets to recognize one or two underlying constructs, and you will have an instant global price. You have a physical underlying, and all of a sudden you're in a completely different realm. So I don't think we're very far from that at all. It's just agreeing on a couple of constructs underlying, and the whole market will flip in that regard. I think that's how that can evolve.
Yeah, and consumer pressure and investor pressure is certainly in the right direction there. So, well, that's all I have. If you have any other thoughts.
No, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you for